This is a story about the quiet language of hands, how a hand offered hilt first is a vow of trust, how a hand that bandages a cut speaks of devotion, and how two hands, finding each other in the lamplight of a silent kitchen, can build a home. It is a story for those who know that the truest love is not found in grand declarations, but in the steady, gentle rhythm of a shared life. Elias Thorne measured his days in silence. The sun rose, and he checked the pins on the door he'd reinforced. It held. He drew water from the well, the rope whispering against the wood, the only sound beside the low moan of the prairie wind. His house was a fortress of solitude, built with his own hands on the edge of redemption, a town that had yet to offer him any. Inside, the floors were swept, the single plate and cup were clean, and the bed against the far wall was made for one. It was an orderly existence, a life scrubbed clean of want or expectation. Yet the quiet in the small house was a physical weight. It pressed on his shoulders as he mended a harness, the needle's precise work a poor substitute for conversation. He was a man who listened more than he spoke, but there was nothing here to listen to. He had taken in his late sister's boy, Leo, and the child's grief had settled into a mirror of his own, a quietness that filled the rooms until they felt airless. Elias scanned the horizon not for threats, but from a habit born of loneliness, his gaze always returning to the empty chair across his small kitchen table. The routines kept the hollowness at bay, but at night, when the lamp was out and the only light was a sliver of moon through the window, he would feel the shape of his isolation vast, silent, and absolute. The letter from the church matron had promised a housekeeper, someone to manage the home and mind the boy while he worked the forge. It was a practical solution. But when he stood on the station platform, the steam hissing from the arriving train, he felt a flicker of something that was not practical at all. It was the foolish, buried hope of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to not be alone. The woman who stepped from the train was not what he'd expected. She was smaller, for one, and held herself with a stillness that spoke less of a hired housekeeper and more of someone bracing for a blow. Her name was Annelise, her face pale beneath the brim of a simple hat, her hands clutching a worn carpet-bag as if it were an anchor. Elias felt a protective instinct rise in him, sharp and unwelcome. He was there for a business arrangement, nothing more. He took a step forward, ready to state his name, to begin the transaction. But before he could speak, a small body hurtled past him. Leo, who rarely spoke and never ran, launched himself toward the woman, his small hands grabbing the fabric of her skirt. He looked up, his face streaked with dust and desperate hope. "Mama," he cried, the word a ragged tear in the station's quiet hum. "Mama, you finally came." Annelise froze, her gaze dropping from Elias's face to the child clinging to her legs. Her knuckles were white on the handle of her bag. Elias saw the terror in her eyes, the swift, hunted look of a cornered animal. She had come to redemption for a husband, a home, a life promised in a letter. Instead, she was met by a silent, scarred man and a child, calling her a name that was not hers, a name that promised a past she did not have and a future she could not comprehend. Her world and his had just tilted on its axis. The practical arrangement had fractured, and in its place was a raw, aching need that neither of them had prepared for. Annelise's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of whalebone and fear. The child's grip was surprisingly strong, his plea echoing in the space between them. She looked from his desperate, upturned face to the man who stood a few feet away, his expression unreadable, carved from prairie dust and shadow. He was tall and broad, his stillness a stark contrast to her own inner turmoil. This was Elias Thorne, the man her letter was from. But the letter had promised a husband, a simple arrangement for a respectable life. It had said nothing of a child. It had said nothing of the profound loneliness in the man's eyes, a reflection of the very thing she was trying to escape. "I "I think there's been a mistake," she said, her voice a thin thread against the vastness of the sky. Elias finally moved, his steps deliberate as he closed the distance. He did not reach for the boy, but knelt, placing a large, calloused hand gently on Leo's shoulder. "Leo," he said, his voice low and rough, like stones rolling in a riverbed, "this is Miss Annelise. She's come to help." The word hung in the air, inadequate. Annelise saw the boy's face crumple, the hope extinguishing like a snuffed candle. The sight sent a sharp pang through her chest. In the tense, quiet journey to the homestead, Elias explained in sparse sentences. The boy was his nephew. His sister had passed a year prior. He was Leo's guardian. The letter for a housekeeper had been sent by the pastor's wife, who had, it seemed, taken certain liberties with the truth to ensure a response. Annelise listened, her own story of dispossession, of having nowhere else to go remaining locked behind her teeth. The house, when they arrived, was as silent and stoic as its owner. It was clean, orderly, and achingly empty. Elias showed her to a small, private room at the back, its single window looking out onto an endless expanse of grass. "You are not obligated to stay," he said, his back to her as he stood in the doorway. "I will pay for your ticket back or to wherever you need to go. No one will think less of you." It was an honorable offer, a chance to flee. But Annelise looked at the neatly made bed, the clean pitcher of water on the washstand, and then she thought of the child's heartbroken face. She thought of returning to nothing. Here, at least, was a place. Here, at least, was a man who offered her a choice. "And the boy?" she asked quietly. Elias's shoulders tightened. "He will be fine." But she heard the lie in his voice, the weary resignation of a man trying to hold back the tide with his bare hands. She set her bag down on the floor. It made a soft, definitive sound in the quiet room. "I will stay," she said, not as a prospective bride, but as something else, something not yet named. "I will take the position. As your housekeeper." It was a boundary, a line drawn in the sand of their misunderstanding. He turned, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than guardedness in his eyes. It might have been relief. "Thank you," he said, the words simple, but carrying the weight of a world. The first days were a careful dance of proximity. Annelise learned the geography of Elias's silence, the way he moved through the house with a quiet competence that left little room for intrusion. She, in turn, established her own rhythms. The scent of baking bread began to fill the kitchen, a warm, living smell that pushed back against the sterile quiet. She learned that Leo, though silent, would watch her from doorways, his gaze full of a deep, unvoiced yearning. She did not press him, but would sometimes leave a freshly baked biscuit on the table where he might find it. Elias would return from the forge, late in the afternoon, his face smudged with soot, his presence filling the small house. He never entered the kitchen while she was working, but would stand at the threshold, waiting to be acknowledged. It was a sign of respect, a quiet ceding of the space to her. One evening, she noticed a tear in the sleeve of his work shirt, the fabric frayed and thin. The next morning, while he was at the forge, she took the shirt from the hook by the door. The cotton was rough beneath her fingers, smelling of metal and sweat. She sat in the rocking chair, the needle a small silver fish darting through the coarse fabric. It was an intimate act, mending the garment that lay against his skin, and she felt a strange warmth spread through her chest. When he returned that evening, she had folded the shirt and placed it on his chair. He picked it up, his large thumb brushing over the neat, even stitches. He looked at her, his eyes dark in the growing twilight. He did not say thank you. Instead, he asked, "Did Leo eat?" It was a question about his nephew, but it felt like more. It felt like the beginning of a conversation that had nothing to do with words. He was beginning to see her not as a solution to a problem, but as a presence in his home. His protection, once a general sense of duty, was slowly sharpening its focus, narrowing to include the woman who now mended his clothes and fed his child. From his corner of the main room, Elias watched her teach Leo his letters. She had a slate and a small piece of chalk, her voice a low, patient murmur as she guided the boy's small hand to form an A. Leo, who had barely spoken a dozen words since his arrival, was rapt, his focus entirely on the gentle woman beside him. A stray lock of her hair fell across her brow, and she tucked it back with an unconscious grace. A feeling unfamiliar and sharp pierced the calloused shell around Elias's heart. It was a dangerous feeling, one he had buried long ago with his sister. It was longing. He saw the way Annelise left a cup of herbal tea for him on the edge of the hearth each evening, still warm when he came in from his final check of the property. He had never asked her to. It was a small, silent gesture of care he had not realized he was missing until it was there. In return, he began leaving a freshly cut piece of kindling by the stove each morning, ensuring her fire would be easy to start. They spoke little, their communication built from these quiet offerings. One evening, a sudden summer rainstorm broke, the wind rattling the windows. Leo, startled by a loud clap of thunder, let out a small cry. Annelise was there in an instant, kneeling by his pallet, her hand on his back. "It is only the sky," she whispered, her voice a shield against the storm. "We are safe in here." Elias stood in the shadows of the doorway, watching her. He had built this house to be a fortress against the world, but he had never known how to make it feel safe. She did. As she settled the boy back to sleep, she rose and saw him standing there. The air between them crackled with an energy that had nothing to do with the lightning outside. Her courage was a tangible thing. She met his gaze directly, without fear. She had claimed her space in this house not with demands, but with quiet dignity and acts of tenderness. He realized his methodical scanning of rooms for threats had changed. Now, when he entered a room, his first instinct was to find her, to read her posture, to gauge her state of mind. His protective instinct was no longer just for the boy. It was for her. And he knew, with a certainty that shook him, that his carefully constructed loneliness was beginning to crumble. A week later, the storm returned, this time inside the house. A nightmare seized Leo, his muffled cries waking the silent home. Elias reached him first, but his attempts to soothe the boy were clumsy, his large hands only making the child flinch. Annelise appeared in the doorway, a shawl around her shoulders, her presence immediately calming. She did not hesitate. "May I?" she asked, her gaze meeting Elias's over the boy's trembling form. He nodded, stepping back, ceding the space. She sat on the edge of the small bed, her hand finding Leo's, her voice a low lullaby of reassurance. The child's shudders slowly subsided, his breathing evening out as he drifted back to a more peaceful sleep. Annelise did not move, her hand remaining over the boy's. The silence that settled was different, not empty, but filled with a shared, unspoken tenderness. Elias watched her, the lamplight carving soft hollows in her face. He saw the strength in her, the deep well of compassion she drew from. He saw a woman who could make a home out of a hollow shell. When she finally rose, she moved to leave, to return to her own room. "Wait," Elias said, the word rough in his throat. She paused, her back to him. He cleared his throat, the words feeling foreign and heavy on his tongue. "It would be better for the boy if you were closer." It was a practical excuse, a shield for the real reason. He wanted her closer. He wanted the warmth of her presence to push back the ever-present chill. He gestured toward the main room. "There is room. I can sleep by the hearth." It was an invitation to cross a threshold, to change the very architecture of their arrangement. She turned slowly, her eyes searching his face in the dim light, looking for the truth beneath his clumsy words. She was assessing him, gauging his intent, as a survivor does. "Only for the boy's sake?" she asked, her voice quiet but direct, demanding honesty. Elias felt the blood rise in his neck. He could lie. He could maintain the pretense. But this woman, who had shown him nothing but quiet courage, deserved more. No, he said, his voice dropping lower. Not only for him. The admission hung between them, vulnerable and stark. He was offering her a choice, placing his own burgeoning hope in her hands. Annelise held his gaze for a long moment, the storm outside a distant echo of the one inside. Then she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I will stay near," she said. It was not a promise of romance, but it was a vow of a different kind, an agreement to remain, to deepen their fragile, growing closeness. It was a choice, made in the dead of night, to step into a shared space. The shift was subtle, but profound. Annelise now slept on a pallet near the hearth, her presence a soft, breathing counterpoint to the house's usual silence. The domestic proximity wove them closer. Elias found himself listening for the sound of her turning in her sleep, a small comfort in the vast darkness. Their arrangement, however, did not go unnoticed. A trip to the general store for supplies brought them under the scrutiny of Mr. Sterling, a local rancher with an acquisitive gleam in his eye and a reputation for taking what he wanted. He tipped his hat to Annelise, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Thorne," he said, his voice overloud in the quiet store. "I hadn't heard you'd acquired? Such fine help." The insinuation was clear, painting Annelise as little more than property. Elias felt a cold anger tighten in his gut. He moved to stand slightly in front of her, a subtle shield. "Miss Annelise is my housekeeper," he stated, his tone flat and final. But Sterling's gaze remained on her, lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. "A woman like you shouldn't be cooped up in that dusty little shack," Sterling said directly to her, ignoring Elias completely. "My home has proper rooms, proper accommodations for a lady." It was a coercive offer masquerading as a kindness, an attempt to isolate her and assert his power. Annelise straightened her spine, her chin lifting. "I am quite content where I am, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "Mr. Thorne's home is more than proper." She chose her side, her words a quiet declaration of loyalty that resonated more powerfully than any shout. The confrontation was brief, nonviolent, but it left a toxic residue in the air. On the walk home, the silence between them was tense. Elias's hands were clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw tight. He was furious at Sterling, but also at himself for exposing her to such a man. The encounter had tested their fragile bond, and now the unspoken questions hung between them. What were they to each other? Housekeeper and employer? Or something more? The social pressure had drawn a line, forcing them to stand on the same side, and in doing so, revealed the depth of the connection that had been quietly growing between them in the safety of their isolated home. That night, the tension from the store followed them home, settling in the corners of the small house like dust. Leo was asleep, and the only sound was the chirp of crickets outside the open window. Annelise sat at the kitchen table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Elias stood by the window, staring out into the darkness, the muscles in his back rigid. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken words. It was Annelise who broke it. "He reminds me of a man I knew before," she said, her voice so low he almost didn't hear it. A man who believed a woman's gratitude was a debt he could collect whenever he pleased. The admission was a key turning in a lock. She was offering him a piece of her past, a glimpse into the reasons for her guardedness, for the proud resilience that was her armor. Elias turned from the window, his own history rising to meet hers. He sat down opposite her at the small table, the lamplight between them creating an island of intimacy in the dark room. "My sister," he began, his voice rough with disuse. "Her husband, he was not a kind man. He saw her as his possession. When he died, she was left with nothing but the boy and a broken spirit. I brought her here to be safe. He paused, the memory a raw wound. She passed from a fever that winter. I failed to protect her. The confession was torn from him, a secret shame he had carried alone. He had built this house, this life of rigid control, as a penance. He was the protector who had failed. Annelise listened, her expression full of a deep, resonant empathy. She reached a hand across the table, not to touch him, but as an offering, a bridge across the space that separated them. "You did not fail her, Elias," she said, speaking his name softly for the first time. The sound of it on her lips was both a comfort and a shock. "You gave her a refuge. You are giving her son a home." Her words were a balm on an old hurt. For the first time, he felt the crushing weight of his guilt lessen. In her eyes, he was not a failure, but a man of honor. He looked at her, truly saw her the survivor who met the world with courage, who initiated boundaries, who offered trust when it had been broken before. He slowly unclenched the fist he hadn't realized he was making and placed his hand on the table near hers. The invitation was there, in the space between their fingers, a silent question. She answered by gently covering his hand with her own. The touch was light, but it was an anchor. In the quiet of the lamplit kitchen, their shared histories opened the final emotional door, transforming their arrangement into a bond forged not of convenience, but of mutual understanding and profound respect. The annual Founders' Day picnic was an obligation, a necessary appearance to maintain a semblance of community. Elias hated it, but knew that for Annelise and Leo to be accepted, they had to be seen. The tension was palpable as soon as they arrived. Sterling was there, holding court near the refreshment table, his eyes finding Annelise immediately. He made his way toward them, his presence an unwelcome shadow on the sunlit afternoon. Elias instinctively moved closer to Annelise, a silent signal of solidarity. "Ma'am," Sterling began, addressing Annelise while pointedly ignoring Elias, "I trust you've reconsidered my generous offer. A town picnic is hardly a suitable environment for a woman of your quality, forced to associate with blacksmiths." The insult was deliberate, a public attempt to shame Elias and assert his own social dominance. The townsfolk nearby quieted, their gazes shifting between the two men. This was more than a private dispute now. It was a public challenge. Annelise's hand, which had been resting on Leo's shoulder, tightened. Elias saw the fear in her eyes, but also a flicker of defiance. This was their confrontation, and it would not be won with fists. He met Annelise's gaze, a whole conversation passing between them in a heartbeat. "Are you with me?" his eyes asked. Her chin lifted in a clear, resolute answer. "I am." He did not raise his voice. He did not issue a threat. He simply took Annelise's hand in his, lacing their fingers together in a gesture that was both tender and unbreakable. He then looked directly at Sterling, his voice low and steady, carrying across the sudden quiet. "This is my wife," he said. The words were plain, unadorned, but they were a vow, a shield, and a declaration all in one. A collective gasp went through the small crowd. Annelise squeezed his hand, her choice made, her alliance declared for all to see. She stood beside him, no longer just a housekeeper or a woman under his protection, but his partner. Sterling's face flushed a dark, ugly red. He had expected fear, or at least submission. He was met with an unmovable, united front. He sputtered for a moment, then turned on his heel and stalked away, defeated not by violence, but by the quiet, powerful force of two people choosing each other. In the silence that followed, Elias looked down at their joined hands. It was the most profound promise he had ever made. He had chosen her, and she, with a simple squeeze of her hand, had chosen him back. The wagon ride home was quiet, but the silence was different now. It was not the empty, aching silence of loneliness, nor the tense silence of unspoken feelings. It was a shared silence, comfortable and deep, the kind that exists only between two people who have weathered a storm together and found themselves on the same shore. Leo, exhausted from the day, was asleep in the back, curled up on a blanket. Back at the homestead, the adrenaline of the confrontation faded, leaving a tender sore feeling in its wake. As Annelise climbed down from the wagon, Elias noticed she was favoring one hand. "You're hurt," he said, his voice laced with concern. She looked down at her palm, where the handle of her basket, gripped too tightly during the confrontation with Sterling, had broken the skin. A thin line of red welled against her skin. "It's nothing," she said, but he shook his head. Inside, he gently took her hand and led her to the kitchen table. He lit a lamp, the warm glow pushing back the evening shadows. He fetched the small tin of antiseptic salve and a roll of clean linen bandages from a shelf. His touch was incredibly careful as he cleaned the small cut, his large, calloused fingers moving with a surgeon's precision. He was a man used to shaping iron with force and fire, yet he tended to her small injury with a reverence that made her breath catch in her throat. This was his love language, not in pretty words, but in quiet, deliberate acts of care, aftercare, tending to a wound she had received while defending their shared honor. When he was done, he did not immediately release her hand. He held it for a moment, his thumb stroking softly over her wrist, feeling the steadying pulse beneath her skin. He met her gaze across the table, his eyes dark with an emotion she was just beginning to understand. "Thank you," he said, the words encompassing everything. "Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for making this house a home." She simply nodded, her throat too tight for words. Later, they ate a simple meal of bread and cheese, the silence of the kitchen a comforting blanket. It was the first meal they shared not as an employer and his housekeeper, but as partners, their future a quiet, unwritten promise in the soft lamplight. The days that followed the picnic settled into a new rhythm, one of established partnership. The pretense of their original arrangement had been burned away, leaving something truer and more resilient in its place. One morning, Annelise was at the table, a small ledger and a pencil in hand, trying to make sense of the household accounts. Ink smudged her fingers, a dark stain on her skin. Elias came in from the forge for a midday meal and saw her frustration. He walked to the wash basin, pumped fresh water, and motioned for her. "Here," he said. He took her hand, his touch now familiar and welcome, and gently began to wash the ink from her fingers with a coarse bar of soap. He was methodical, his thumbs working in slow circles, cleaning away the stain until her skin was clean. The simple domestic act was more intimate than a kiss. It was an act of service, a quiet declaration that her burdens were now his to share. He was washing away the frustrations of her day, caring for her in a way no one ever had. She watched the play of lamplight on his jawline, the concentration in his eyes as he focused on his task. When he finished, he dried her hand on a clean cloth, his fingers lingering for a moment before he let go. That evening, as they sat in comfortable silence, she returned the gesture. He was cleaning a piece of equipment, his own hands stained with grease and soot. She rose, heated a small pot of water on the stove, and brought it to him with a rag. She didn't speak, but simply began to wipe the grime from his knuckles. He stilled, allowing her to tend to him, his gaze fixed on her face. It was a reciprocal act of care, a mirroring of his earlier tenderness. In that moment, a silent vow was exchanged. "I will care for you. I will tend to your hurts. I will wash the ink and the grime from your hands." The grand confessions had already been made. This was the aftermath, the living of the vows. This was the quiet, steady work of building a life together, gesture by careful gesture, in the warm, safe light of their kitchen. The homestead began to change, reflecting the union of its inhabitants. It was no longer just Elias's house. It was their home. One afternoon, Annelise stood at the back window, looking out at the patch of dusty, untamed earth behind the house. A garden, she said, more to herself than to him, but he heard. We could have a garden there, for vegetables, and perhaps a few flowers. It was the first time she had spoken of a future that extended beyond the next meal, the next season. It was a statement of intent to put down roots. Elias looked from her face, illuminated by the afternoon sun, to the patch of ground she was indicating. He saw it through her eyes, not a barren plot, but a place of potential, of life. He didn't just agree. The very next morning, he was outside, the sun barely over the horizon, with a shovel and posts. He began to dig, marking out the perimeter of the garden she had imagined. He was building the fence for it, creating a protected space for her dream to grow. He worked all day, the rhythmic thud of the post driver a steady heartbeat for their new life. Annelise brought him water, and they stood together for a moment, surveying his progress. He had built the house as a fortress to keep the world out. Now he was building a fence to bring life in. His protection, once a rigid, defensive posture, had evolved. It was no longer about just keeping her safe from external threats, but about creating an environment where she and they, as a family, could flourish. He was building a home with her, not just for her. The straight lines of the fence posts were a testament to his devotion, a physical manifestation of the orderly love he felt for her. This was his promise, written in sweat and soil. He would build whatever she needed. He would protect whatever she chose to grow. The garden fence was finished by the end of the week, its clean pine posts standing as a testament to a quiet promise. That evening, as Annelise cleared the last of the dinner plates, Elias remained at the table, his hands working on a small block of wood. The scrape of his knife was a soft, rhythmic sound in the quiet kitchen. Leo was asleep, and the house was wrapped in a peaceful hush. When he was finished, he held it out to her. It was a small, intricately carved bird, its wings half spread as if caught in the moment of taking flight. The detail was astonishing, each feather etched with a careful, patient hand. For the home, he said, his voice low. It was not just a gift. It was a symbol. A bird free to fly, but choosing to alight here. It was his recognition of her autonomy, of the fact that she had chosen this life, this home, him. Annelise took the small token, its wooden form warm and smooth in her palm. She traced the delicate lines of the wings with her fingertip. No jewels or fine silks could have meant more. This small carving, wrought by his own hands, held the entirety of his heart. She looked at him, her eyes shining in the lamplight. She didn't need to say thank you. He could see it in her gaze. Instead, she spoke his name, her voice full of a warmth and tenderness that was new, a tone reserved only for him. Elias, she whispered. It was a vow in itself. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers, their fingers interlacing around the small bird. They did not need to speak of the future. They were already building it. It was here, in the shared silence of their kitchen, in the weight of his hand over hers, in the simple, profound promise of a shared tomorrow, sealed not with a kiss, but with a quiet understanding and a piece of carved wood that meant everything. The protector and the survivor had found their refuge, not in a fortress, but in each other.